on the call. Oh, see, it is, so we're going to continue this meeting. The slides will be shared out after this session with everybody who is registered today, and ditto for the second session. And please use the chat to enter questions at any time during the conversation. If it's appropriate to ask your question during the presentation, Amy or I can introduce those questions, but we also have time scheduled at the end for questions and answers. There will be a 5-minute break in the presentation at around the midpoint. And you can pin the speakers by right-clicking on the 3 dots that appear in the right-hand corner above the speaker's pictures and select pin speaker. And I have been able to do it. So if I can do it, you can do it. A very quick review of today's agenda. We're going to talk about the learning objectives, the discussion of the problem. What are the economic needs of survivors? What are the barriers that survivors face? How can comprehensive case management address survivors' economic needs? Followed by about 15 minutes of Q&A. The most important housekeeping task that I want to bring up is we are talking about sexual violence today. We invite and encourage you to be mindful of your own needs and take a breath or a break anytime you need. And because I work with all the rape crisis centers in the state, I will say in every state, we have rape crisis centers that offer 24/7 hotlines. Please reach out anytime in your today or in your entire life if you want to talk to somebody who is trained to listen. I want to pass it over to my colleague, Amy Waldman.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Amy Waldman. I work with Janice. I'm the co-director of capacity building and equity programs at the Department of Public Health in Massachusetts, our division of sexual and domestic violence prevention and services. And we thought just to start, we would have a quick poll just to see who is joining us today. And if you could just take a minute to fill out this poll, we will launch it now, and then please just fill it out and we will get a sense of who's with us. Folks seeing the poll? Just thumbs up if you are. Okay. Here we go. Just take 30 more seconds. Okay. So it looks like we have, many people joining us from state and federal and local government, a few folks from schools, and about half the folks are coming from sexual and domestic violence programs as well. And in terms of familiarity for Claire and Becca, looks like about half the folks have some familiarity with this, and others are just joining us who may not have as much. So we're so delighted to have all of you with us. And with that, I'm going to say, I think, is Deanna Mancetta on the call from Jane Doe? Okay, well, perhaps Deanna at our next session can do, and she was going to welcome us. She's from our state coalition. And Janice, I'm just going to turn it back to you to make some introductions.
Thanks, Amy. We have two presenters here today, and I am really excited about the work that they have done and what I'm going to learn from them today and in the next session. Rebecca Loya is a research scientist. You can say hello, Rebecca, at the Institute for Economic and Racial Equity at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. Becca conducts research on issues related to family economic stability, the economic impacts of sexual violence, and the protective effects of financial assets and social capital. Becca has a PhD in social policy from the Heller School of Social Policy and Management at Brandeis, and a master's degree in psychology from Stanford University. Claire Namuga is program manager at Boston Area Rape Crisis Center. Claire is an LCSW licensed clinical social worker, and she works to ensure the planning, program development, and quality of services being delivered in the case management program and in coordination with other direct and training services. She works directly with sexual violence survivors to address their housing and financial needs, educational programs, and she advocates around policies focusing on housing and economic stability for survivors. I'm going to pass it along. Just want to add in here that Becca has a master's degree in social work from Simmons University. So clearly sorry, Becca.
Sorry, Claire has that.
Claire has a master's degree from our lovely Simmons. And I just want to say that, so we have two other rich and famous social workers on the call with us today, and I bet we have more. So I'm going to turn this over to Becca.
Thank you so much. I'm sharing my screen here so everyone can see it. Thank you very much for joining us today to talk about this important topic. I was just going to briefly start by going over our learning objectives, but before I do that, I just want to recognize that we have a lot of expertise in this virtual room, and I know that's really powerful, and we are hoping there will be opportunities to hear from you and have you share your experience and knowledge during our Q&A and during our discussion. So our objectives, Janice already covered these a bit, but as she mentioned, it's a two-part training. The first is today, the second is June 28th. And our objectives for these two trainings are, number one, that we'll understand the broad economic consequences and challenges that are triggered by sexual violence. Number two, to identify barriers to economic stability. And number three, to learn how comprehensive case management can address survivors' complex economic needs. And finally, to recognize areas of opportunity for policy reform and innovation. Today, we're primarily going to be focusing on the first three goals, and we'll focus more on policy reforms in our second session on the 28th. And I hope you can join us then. So we're going to start today by going through an overview of what is known about the economic needs of sexual assault survivors. I am a researcher, so I'm going to be telling you what has been documented in the research, including some of my own work, but mostly the work of many other researchers in the field over many years. Before we delve into costs, let's just take a moment to consider the scope of this problem. So nationwide, sexual violence affects 43.6% of women, 24.8% of men. We also know numbers, I'm sorry, I don't have them on this slide, are much higher for people who don't identify with either of these categories. These numbers are from the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Study, and it includes contact sexual violence. So that's rape, being made to penetrate someone else, sexual coercion, or other unwanted sexual contact. We are talking about a problem of epidemic proportions, which is worthy of our attention and concern, both about people's mental and physical well-being, but also about their economic well-being. And I think that'll become clear as we see some of the effects that Claire and I will both speak about today. First, a bit of background. So research has extensively documented that intimate partner violence has detrimental effects on survivors' employment, earnings, and housing. So the economic needs of IPV survivors have gotten relatively a lot of attention in terms of research, policy, and service provision. And in fact, many IPV service providers offer economic services to address these needs. And all of this attention and all of these services are warranted, and even more is needed. And in addition to that, we want to share with you today that non-IPV sexual assault, that sexual assault that's not a part of a pattern of abuse by an intimate partner, can also have profound economic effects for survivors. Yet much less attention has been paid to non-IPV sexual assault. So in this training, we are going to focus mainly on how non-IPV sexual assault affects survivors in their economic lives and their economic well-being. So let's start by looking at some of the costs of sexual violence. Cora Peterson, who is a researcher at the CDC, and her team set out to quantify the lifetime costs of rape. They estimate that each rape costs $137,275. And this equates to an economic burden of $3.5 trillion in costs to the United States as a whole. This estimate includes physical and mental health care, lost productivity, public services, and criminal justice activities. But these stunning numbers are only part of the story. These are only the minimal identifiable costs. They don't include the costs of moving or housing disruption. They don't include intangible costs like pain and suffering. They only focus on rape, not other forms of sexual assault. And many health outcomes that are associated with sexual violence are not included in this analysis. So it is fair to say that the true costs are even higher. These estimates include costs to survivors as well as costs paid by perpetrators and the government. But we know that sexual assault survivors directly bear many of the expenses related to sexual assault, including the costs of medical and mental health care, residential relocation, and lost wages. These expenses create financial hardship for those who can't afford the additional new costs, the additional new $140,000 or more in their lives. Today, I'm going to briefly outline the economic costs and impacts in four main areas of survivors' lives: medical, education, employment, and housing. It's important to note that this list is not comprehensive. There are many additional expenses and economic costs, and many ways that costs in each of these domains can have a ripple effect, creating financial stress and crisis in other areas of life. You'll see that many other kinds of costs will also come up during the course of our training. So let's begin by looking at the financial costs associated with medical care. Sexual violence is associated with a range of physical and mental health concerns, including but not limited to post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, suicidality, substance abuse, physical and mental health challenges, unintended pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, injury, and illness. And these treatments for all of these conditions come with costs, including co-payments, medication costs, emergency room fees, ambulance bills, travel, childcare, time off from work. The list could go on and on. These conditions bring many economic and financial consequences besides the costs as well, and I didn't put those on the slide. Mental and physical health conditions can interfere with survivors' ability to work or attend school. The additional costs can also draw money away from other financial needs. And I'll talk more about those ripple effects in a bit. So the same study that I mentioned earlier by Cora Peterson and colleagues at the CDC, they estimated the lifetime costs of medical care to be $53,838. This includes the cost of care for mental and physical health needs related to sexual violence. And again, if you recall my caveats I gave you earlier, this is likely also an underestimate, but it gives us a sense of the magnitude of this problem, economically speaking, and medically speaking. Now we'll turn to how sexual violence impacts students. In the context of an education setting, we have that same set of consequences as we just discussed, the trauma response, physical and mental health issues. And we also know these can be compounded by a perpetrator's presence on or near campus and by the institutional and peer response. This can lead to some educational impacts, including taking time off to recover, declining performance and declining grades, and of course, even dropping out of school. And this in turn has economic implications. If a survivor takes time off, their tuition costs go up. Their time spent in school goes up. If their grades go down, students can lose their scholarships and financial aid. And future opportunities can be less due to all of these prior effects. These educational effects have measurable economic consequences. Survivors who need to take a semester or more off generally cannot get the tuition and fees that they've already paid back. After a certain point in the semester, most schools have a zero refund policy. And these expenses are not trivial. So this would come in the form of either increased expenses or increased debt, but one semester's tuition, room, and board add up to $8,990 for public schools and $23,007 for private nonprofit universities on average. So this is a substantial amount of money. Of course, dropping out of school also has substantial costs. The average worker with a bachelor's degree earns $26,000 more than a worker with a high school diploma. And having an AA degree adds $7,300 per year. And indeed, sexual violence in adolescence is associated with lower earnings in young adulthood. So even after we get past those costs that are directly going to the school, we're talking about survivors earning less as a result of the violence that they experienced. So Ross McMillan and his colleagues found that sexual assault survivors in a Canadian sample earned more than $9,000 less in young adulthood compared to those who hadn't experienced violence. And 48 to 69% of this effect was due to diminished educational attainment and occupational status. This team of researchers suggests that sexual assault and other forms of violence set off a cascade of negative consequences in a young person's life, including diminishing their educational attainment. And then it goes on from there and cascades in terms of the economic consequences over their lives. Now we'll turn to employment impacts. So those same documented consequences of sexual violence can impact employment in a number of ways. These include needing to take time off from work, having decreased performance on the job, job loss. So this is both quitting one's job and being terminated, and temporarily or permanently being unable to work. And of course, this in turn leads to economic effects, including lost wages, decreased income, and decreased earning power over the long term. These employment consequences have measurable and long-lasting impacts on survivors' earnings. I mentioned a little bit of survivors' earnings on the previous slide, but we'll look from a different angle here. The estimated lifetime costs of lost productivity is $71,455. And again, this is a minimum identifiable costs. And these are also average costs across the population. So some individuals may lose much more than this and some much less, but it gives us a sense of the magnitude of the problem. Now let's turn to housing and residential mobility. Researchers have documented that sexual assault survivors often need to move for safety reasons. In addition, survivors who live in subsidized housing face many barriers to moving, including waiting lists, high relocation costs, and absence of alternative housing options. As we all know, moving comes with many costs, including costs to transport or replace possessions, the security deposit, fees to break an existing lease, and first and last month's rent on the new home. Research has not formally documented the costs associated with moving due to sexual violence, at least to my knowledge. But here we theorize the costs and consequences to survivors. As we've seen, even independent of economic consequences, sexual violence creates reasonable fear and safety concerns, which leads some survivors to need to relocate for safety reasons. This creates moving costs. For those with tight financial circumstances, this can lead to difficulty affording housing. In addition, we've now established that sexual violence leads to financial costs and effects on education and earnings, which can lead to economic instability. This instability can make it difficult for survivors to afford their housing. This can, of course, lead to relocation and the expenses associated with moving. And most severely, when financial and social resources are short, this can put survivors at risk for homelessness. So I know this slide shows a lot of arrows, which might feel overwhelming, but I hope that it starts to convey the complex interaction of events that can place sexual assault survivors at risk for housing destabilization or even homelessness. And this is a domain, like, as I said, that isn't included in the economic models of even estimating the costs of sexual violence, but it's a very common consequence for survivors. So in sum, we have high costs and consequences in the four main areas that we looked at: medical, education, and employment, as well as housing. And as I've said, these are not comprehensive. There are many other costs in other areas of life. And furthermore, these costs and consequences don't act in isolation. Instead, they interact, compound one another, and create cascading effects across a survivor's life. So this is where we introduce the idea of trajectory shifts. The idea is that these consequences can add up to shift a person off the educational, employment, housing, or earnings path that they were on prior to experiencing sexual violence. We break these into what we call moderate trajectory shifts, which is where a person is temporarily knocked off their path, but they recover eventually after a few years. For instance, they may take a couple of years off from a career and work temp jobs, or delay their education for a couple of years. So in the big picture, these people are still losing X years of potential, but they eventually do recover. Then there are major trajectory shifts, which more permanently affects a person's economic status. And on the next slide, I'm going to share an example of this. So here's an example from a study I conducted a few years back. I interviewed a lawyer who works with sexual violence survivors, and she explained this concept better than I ever could based on her experience working with survivors. She said, what typically will happen is, okay, you miss 1 to 5 days of work. There's those lost wages, but now you get fired for missing those 1 to 5 days of work. So now you're out your entire income. So that's why we do public benefits work. I think that it really spirals. Like, I've talked to clients, I mean, literally, who 20 years after the assault, the trajectory of their life is so totally different than it was the 10 seconds before the rape happened. And now I'm going to share a case example from Claire's work in case management at BARC, which shows the economic consequences of sexual violence from a survivor's perspective. Claire will build more on how case management supported this client to address their economic needs later today. So this was a client who was sexually assaulted by someone he had known for a long time. His trauma experience resulted in a loss of his job and housing. This client was unemployed and homeless for around 6 months. And during this time, he used his credit card to pay for food, gas, and hotels, amounting to about $9,000 in debt. This client was connected to case management after getting a new job. I'm sorry, I'm hearing somebody might need to mute themselves. This client was connected to case management after getting a new job and moving into a new apartment. However, he struggled to move forward financially and in his healing because of the burden of his debt. He reported feeling like every month he needed to choose between paying for rent and food and trying to pay back what he owed on his credit cards. So this illustrates the confluence of forces as they work in real life and how those major trajectory shifts can be very difficult to recover from. Now we'll turn to barriers to achieving economic stability. That case example begins to convey some of the barriers that survivors face, but let's look a little bit deeper. So first thing I want to mention is while it's true that sexual violence can happen to anyone, it's also true that not everyone is able to recover from it the same. The resources that a person has at their disposal matter to recovery. So for instance, low-income survivors are particularly vulnerable to those major trajectory shifts that I just mentioned. This is a chart that shows, in one column, we have higher income and salaried workers who are more likely to have paid time off, health insurance, savings or a budget for new expenses, and access to financial assistance from family and friends. Whereas lower income and hourly workers are not as likely to have any of those resources, but are more likely to face the risk of losing their job if they take time off, and to risk homelessness if they lose their jobs. As I mentioned, the resources that a person has at their disposal matters to recovery. Those with personal financial resources and friends and family in their social network who can provide financial and in-kind supports are better able to access the resources they need to recover, such as time off from work, the counseling, medical care, moving to a new home, having assistance with childcare and bills during recovery. So that means that people who have lesser access to these resources have lesser access to the resources necessary for recovery. As most of you are likely aware, certain populations are overrepresented in poverty and low income. I'm only going to mention a few today. I know there are many more that we could spend some time, quite a bit of time talking about. But people of color, especially Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Pacific Islanders, people with disabilities, and people who are immigrants, especially those who are undocumented, are all overrepresented in poverty and low income. There are many contributing factors we could discuss all day. I actually have taught classes on this, but I'll just mention a few today. Racial wage and wealth gaps mean that some survivors have access to those financial and social resources and some don't, and that this falls sharply along racial lines due to a long history of racialized policies and discrimination, which I'm not going to go into today, but it's very important to mention. People with disabilities face barriers to employment, so this can put survivors in an impossible circumstance if they need to take time off or change jobs for safety reasons. They may be held back by fear of not being able to get a new job in the future, for instance. And of course, immigrants also face barriers to both employment and social services, which can complicate economic recovery. I'm going to provide you with just one example of this intersectional overlapping systemic risk. So this slide focuses on the intersection of race, ethnicity, and economic instability in relation to sexual violence. This model shows what we've covered so far. That's that sexual violence has negative downstream consequences. You can also see that these consequences can be more harsh for marginalized groups. For instance, survivors of color are less likely to receive appropriate post-assault services, which can intensify the negative economic consequences of sexual assault. The other new piece here is the acknowledgement that people of color, particularly women and children who are Black, Native, or Latina, are dramatically overrepresented in poverty. And in addition, let's take into account that marginalized groups have a higher risk of sexual violence. Pre-existing factors, including economic instability and poverty, place individuals at a greater risk for experiencing violence to begin with. So what you can see here is a cycle. Economic instability and sexual violence reinforce each other in a cyclical manner. And as I'll discuss on the next slide, access to certain resources can begin to disrupt this cycle. So this will be my last slide. A lot of the work that we do at my institute looks at the role of what we call assets in people's lives. That refers to those financial and social resources that I mentioned earlier. So I'd like to close by reflecting on this just a bit. Assets can help mitigate risks as well as helping with recovery. So when people have access to those financial and social resources, they can take a number of steps to mitigate their risks, such as selecting a safer neighborhood to live in, working daytime hours at work, opting into safer jobs, maybe owning a car, having access to flexible transportation as needed, and they can more reliably rely on the police. Access to resources also helps with recovery. So as I've mentioned, people can draw on financial savings, health insurance, family support to pay medical, legal, moving, and other expenses, and are more likely to have that paid sick and vacation time. But those who lack financial and social resources are less able to make those investments in safety upfront. So we know that there is a greater risk when folks live and work in higher crime areas. There are certain occupations where individuals face a higher risk for sexual violence. People who don't have a car, don't have flexible transportation options may need to place themselves or are placed in more dangerous situations, and of course, less confidence in police services. And for those who lack resources, again, on the recovery end, this is an even greater uphill battle. So we've discussed that there's that risk of losing a job if people need time off, that the costs of services can be prohibitive. Lack of insurance can also prevent people from getting services they need. Lack of appropriate victim services nearby can be a problem, and there could be financial barriers to relocating. So all of this research leaves me with two lessons. The first is that efforts for economic justice are part of a violence prevention agenda. And I know that might be, obvious to many of you who are on this call, and I hope it is, but oftentimes the two are treated as two separate problems to address. So I want to mention it. The second is that economic support and economic case management services for sexual assault survivors can play a critical role in their recovery. And with that in mind, I'm going to now turn it over to Claire, who will start by talking about the barriers to economic well-being that she has seen in her day-to-day work with clients. And then she'll introduce the work that BARC does to meet survivors' complex economic needs.
Thank you, Becca. Hi, everyone. My name is Claire, like I was earlier introduced, and I use she, her pronouns. And I want to share that English is my second language. It's not my first language. So I'm going to try to speak as clearly as possibly I can. And for whatever reason, if you do not understand something that I say because of my communication, you're welcome to share it in the chat. And the moderator will let me know so that I can clarify what I'm saying. Otherwise, we are going to leave some significant amount of time at the end of the session today for any other questions that have nothing to do with my communication. And so going further into the barriers, I did include in your packets that were sent to you earlier, and I think they've also been included in the chat. I did share a packet that we kept building out of the multiple barriers that our clients experienced as a result of accessing economic opportunities as a result of being a survivor, but also as a result of other systemic issues. And so from our experience, we do know that our survivors are experiencing multiple barriers, such as disabilities, immigration status, low income status. They do face many oppressions that significantly impact their economic stability. The list that I included in your handouts is by no means comprehensive. And as you, the audience, I know we did recognize that there are a lot of experts in the room. So that list, as you, the experts, look at it, you could always add more examples that you see in your work experiences, perhaps, do impact survivors' access to economic opportunities and do impact survivors' economic stability. And so from practical experience, the more barriers that a survivor experiences on that list, the harder it is to achieve economic stability. And so for some of the clients that we work with in our case management program at the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, if they do experience multiple barriers, for us, it means we work with them on a longer term basis, mostly because of their systemic limitations that they encounter that make it difficult for them to achieve timely and meaningful economic goals, such as like the ones Becca mentioned, access to jobs that could help them access a decent income, or access to education opportunities, or even access to affordable housing or benefits. So we're gonna take a 5-minute break, and then I'll go further deep into how our case management program addresses survivors' economic needs. And on break. Okay. All right, so before we went on break, I wanted to mention a few of the barriers that our clients in the case management program at the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center this year have experienced, and what economic needs they impacted. So immigration definitely has continuously presented as a barrier to accessing affordable housing, public benefits, and stable housing. And the lack of affordable housing is has been a barrier to accessing long-term stable and affordable housing. And so with a lack of housing, it's harder to access services and other opportunities that could help a survivor work towards their economic goals. And similarly, a lack of domestic violence shelter space has presented as a barrier to accessing temporary safer housing, which some survivors do need to seek safety in the aftermath of a sexual assault. And then one of the most common ones that has also come up for our clients is the restrictions around the definition of a disability, which in itself, for survivors that may need that as a source of income for different reasons, if they're not able to, work or perform in a job, a formal employment situation, and where they would need access to benefits. For some of our survivors who are feeling unable to work, they may not meet the restrictions around the definition of a disability, and therefore they get denied for disability benefits, as well as the definition of disability impacts some of our survivors, or has impacted some of our survivors' access to housing priorities. Another common one that has come up for our clients as a barrier is the serious mental illness. And so that has made it hard for us to work with survivors alongside their other providers, specifically mental health providers. And so for survivors, for instance, who may be delusional or psychotic, it becomes difficult to engage in service plans with them to address their housing instability needs or homelessness needs. Many of our clients with serious mental illness do not identify as having or needing mental health support, and usually do not follow through with services, or if they follow through, it's like you're starting all over again to communicate what their needs are, how you can support them. So the cycle goes on and on. And another one, so there's not many rape crisis centers that provide comprehensive case management services like the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center is able to do. So that for our clients who do not live in our service area creates a lack of awareness and access to economic opportunities and support to address their economic needs. So this fiscal year alone, so far, between July of last year to this month, our case management program has worked with over 40 clients outside our service area who needed economic support. So, thank you, Becca. So in this part of this session, you're gonna learn more about how our case management program can address survivors' needs, and the goals specifically are that you're gonna understand the need and impact of case management services at our Rape Crisis Center. Then you're gonna understand how our case management framework addresses survivors' needs and some of the tools that we use to address survivors' needs. So as an introduction to case management services at the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, I wanted to share a timeline video about the history of our case management services, together with some major highlights along the way of the program's existence that have influenced how the program addresses survivors' economic needs. So going to the video.
Becca, do you want to stop your share? Thank you.
The Case Management Program at the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center is the only program in a rape crisis center in Massachusetts that provides comprehensive, trauma-informed case management services. The program works with over 200 clients each year, including significant others of survivors. Case managers work with survivors regardless of how long ago their sexual assault experience occurred. It could be a few days or many years ago. There have been many significant developments that have occurred over the course of the case management program's existence. August 2006. Case management was born out of a realization that the healing journey for survivors of sexual violence should encompass holistically addressing their unique housing, financial, and health needs. In November 2008, Victim Compensation made significant changes to the program's eligibility criteria, where survivors who completed an evidence collection kit were no longer required to report an incident to law enforcement to have their medical expenses resulting from the abuse covered. In 2009, a former case management client contributed testimony to support the passing of the 2013 Massachusetts Housing Law for Survivors. In 2013, the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act was enacted and expanded to include protections for sexual assault survivors. In 2013 still, the Massachusetts Housing Law was enacted in April for survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual violence, and stalking. In August 2014, Case Management facilitated their first national presentation at the National Sexual Assault Conference. Titled, Addressing the Economic Impact of Sexual Violence, Research to Practice. The presentation was prepared by Claire and Dr. Becca Loya. In 2016, the program hired the second full-time bilingual case manager. She took on a specialty role of assisting clients with navigating and accessing comprehensive health insurance. She also took on the specialty housing search specialist role. In March 2017, Case Management established a new partnership with the Letters Foundation. Through this collaboration, Case Management was able to assist clients with meeting huge and unique financial needs in more meaningful ways. For instance, a parent whose income was impacted due to committing more time to services for her child, who is a survivor, was able to get assistance with up to 3 months' worth of rental assistance. In 2018, the program hired a part-time client advocate. She provides holistic support to clients around their housing and financial resource needs. Also in 2018, the program hired the third full-time bilingual case manager, who took on a specialty bilingual economic stability case manager role. In February 2019, the program formalized a partnership with the Bullpen Project of Boston. This resource has helped a significant number of clients to access new furniture, security cameras, 1 month's worth of groceries, medical supplies prescribed by clients' medical providers, laptops for school, etc., in a timely manner. In October 2019, Case Management provided consultation with the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center in the initial stages of starting a case management program. In January 2020, a final handbook on the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, Massachusetts State Law and Housing, an overview for housing providers, was published. Case Management contributed to developing the handbook by reviewing and sharing input on topics related to sexual violence survivors' housing rights. Today, the program continues to support survivors' housing and economic needs, navigating systems alongside them, addressing barriers to contribute to economic well-being. Many clients' housing situations have been impacted by the economic impacts of the pandemic. Staff have stayed up to date on constant benefits policy changes and supported clients to understand how those changes relate to their situation to achieve economic stability. The program has assisted clients to access over $220,000 to stabilize and improve their housing situations this fiscal year 2021. This has been a huge increase in financial assistance, partly due to the impact of the pandemic. Thank you for watching.
Okay. Thank you. So that's kind of a summary of the history of the case management program and some of the major highlights that have impacted our services to support survivors' economic needs. And so I want to share more about why it's important to have case management services at our rape crisis centers and why they're so much needed. And I'll explain this from the perspective of the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center's philosophy, as well as foundational perspective. So our mission at the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center is to end all forms of oppression, including economic oppression, as a way to end or prevent sexual violence, as well as to support survivors' healing journeys. Most of our clients in the case management program are highly marginalized and low income. So our direct client work, as well as the systemic advocacy work, aims to address various economic disparities to improve systems to better support clients' overall economic well-being. So the recent expansion of our services to provide more in-depth support around connecting clients to different sources of income based on their abilities. So like employment, disability benefits, public benefits aligns with the efforts to do anti-oppression work. And so the second point is that our services are shaped by the growing needs our clients have presented to us over the years. You've noticed in the video that the case management program at the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center has been here for about 15 years now. And so what we've been doing for all this time is to provide in-depth trauma-informed case management support through the expertise, skills, and knowledge of our team. We work with a significant number of clients whose housing needs and financial resource needs are due to circumstances directly related to sexual violence. We also work with a significant number of clients whose housing and financial needs, whether related to sexual violence or not, do put them in vulnerable situations. For instance, they do present safety concerns for them. When a survivor is, struggling with feeling safe in their housing, or where they're gonna sleep that night, or being able to afford food, we do know that it's much harder for them to focus on their healing if all of these barriers present for them. The third reason that we need case management services at rape crisis centers is that we often do hear that other agencies do similar work. So, why do we refer clients to a case management program at a rape crisis center, and why is it necessary to have a program like this at a rape crisis center? So our case managers are able to build relationships with clients, and they do work with them on all their needs instead of clients having to work or interact with multiple agencies or providers without an advocate on their side. So what we normally do is we advocate within systems and work with other providers. For instance, we advocate within systems that exist to support survivors, affordable housing, health insurance, and public benefits needs. An example is when survivors, it's very common for survivors who have housing needs to be asked to find housing applications on their own and complete them on their own. And sometimes due to language barriers or maybe a disability or one of the other barriers, survivors are not able to complete housing applications and submit them on their own due to those barriers. For instance, one of the clients that we've worked with, and there are so many other examples that are similar to this, but one that I want to pull out is a survivor who was already in a state family shelter, was undocumented, and was living in this space with her daughter. And in this shelter, she was required to complete a certain number of housing applications every week and submit them so that she could hopefully eventually get into affordable housing. Because this survivor had language limitations and these applications were written in English, she just kept completing them so she can comply with the requirements of living in this space. So what she ended up doing is filling in the applications that she wasn't eligible for, and mostly in places that already had closed waiting lists. So when survivors get connected to our case management program, we do work with them on an individualized housing search plan that we actually determine is something that includes only the housing opportunities that they qualify for and ones that they actually are interested in and will ultimately be able to afford. And so that kind of individualized support helps us to only help our clients access systems in the most meaningful way so they can access what they qualify for, limiting all the other barriers that may come up for them in the process. And so I want to also highlight some of the other reasons why we need case management services at our rape crisis center from our most recent data from this fiscal year. So this fiscal year alone, our case management program has worked with over 300 clients, and our case managers have provided at least over 2,900 client engagements or sessions to address various economic and housing needs, especially this year, like you watched in the video, most of the economic needs around housing stability. Our case managers generally work with clients on an average of 3.4 hours per client in at least 14 sessions. And then about 60% of our clients engage in more than one session with a case manager. And so these are some of the most common needs that have come up for our clients. So I'm gonna share some of the tools that our case management program uses as a guide to provide case management services to our clients. In your handouts, I included a tool that highlights our trauma-informed approach to addressing survivors' needs and the values embedded in this tool. So this tool is called SEEK, which stands for Safety, Empathy, Empowerment, Connection, and Knowledge. So briefly, when we are working with survivors throughout our working relationships with them, it is important for us to consider their safety first. So we need to assess appropriately for and support our clients around their various safety needs, whether that's physical safety needs, emotional or mental health safety needs. Sometimes this may necessitate us working alongside other providers to realistically address these needs. In terms of empathy, as case managers, we need to be empathic and mindful of the nature of our communications with our clients, including the tones of our voices, validating their experiences when interacting and engaging with them to build a trusting and safer working environment. And then for empowerment, as case managers, we need to be mindful that survivors know what is best for them. Our job is only to inform them about various resource options that might address their specific needs and let them guide us or let us know how best they want us to support them meaningfully. We do know that sexual violence takes away survivors' sense of power and control, and our approaches need to be ones that create that space that contributes to regaining that power and control for them. And then in terms of connection, when we listen fully and acknowledge as well as validate our clients, we are creating those connections with them. And so when we treat someone with respect, without judgment, as a survivor is more likely to connect with us, and therefore they are more likely to provide us with the information that we are seeking, and they're more likely to participate in the working relationships that we have with them for us to better support them around their needs. And the knowledge for care, as case managers, we need to challenge ourselves to learn about resources, both our internal resources within our organizations as well as external resources. We also need to understand how these resources and systems work and constantly change. As you watched in the video, one of our main tasks, for instance, this year has been to keep up to date on the constant federal policy changes and trying to keep our clients up to date on how this is impacting them. So that's always important for us to keep in mind, equipping ourselves with knowledge, new knowledge all the time, so that we can better support our clients and support them to make fully informed decisions. That is our SEEK model. And so another model that is very specific to the case management program, which I also included a copy in your handouts, by the way, it was created, this framework was created to define a working lens for case management services and to better contextualize the major goals of our services. So the three major goals of this framework are the economic and housing justice, which basically is addressing survivors' economic and housing issues that survivors experience as a direct result to sexual violence. And then the short-term economic and housing stability, which is supporting survivors' short-term emergency housing and economic needs. And then longer-term housing and economic stability, which is supporting survivors' longer-term housing and economic needs. So briefly, for the economic and housing justice goal, our perspective is that to the best extent possible, survivors should not be liable for the economic and housing consequences that a sexual violence experience has caused on them. And therefore, it's only fair for us as advocates or case managers to aim to ensure that they have access to resources and knowledge, as well as the support that they need and deserve to address those impacts in all possible ways. And then in general, for the longer term economic and housing stability, when case managers support survivors to access meaningful housing and economic opportunities that are able to sustain their self-sufficiency needs over a long period of time, we are contributing to their longer term economic and housing stability. And then in terms of the short-term housing and economic stability, when case managers intervene to support survivors to meet immediate housing and economic needs in crisis situations, we are contributing to their short-term and long-term economic and housing stability. Again, similar to this framework, as you can visualize it here, our work to contribute to achieving these three major goals that I just highlighted earlier is centered around three main roles, which is like assessment and education and holistic support. So sometimes these three goals that I just mentioned are interconnected. For instance, when we support a survivor to address their emergency housing needs with a goal to contribute to some sort of short-term stability, the outcome could as well lead to some kind of housing justice or some longer-term housing stability. For instance, if they are connected to somebody working with them in a domestic violence shelter, they can work with that provider or with us in collaboration to work with them as they find some sort of safety. We can begin working with them on their longer term goals, whether that's education or employment or other longer term goals. So similarly, if we support a survivor to access victim compensation funds, for instance, if they lost their income as a result of sexual violence, the intended goal for that is to kind of contribute towards their economic justice. However, that could ultimately also lead to some longer term economic stability. So this framework, as you can see in this chart, also allows us to contextualize our macro level work to support survivors' economic needs. So here are some of the ways that case management, as you can see in the chart, engages in larger systemic work. Our case managers provide trainings with our shelter and affordable housing providers on responding to disclosures of sexual violence and creating trauma-informed spaces, which are guided by the anti-economic oppression and empowerment framework. And then our case managers engage in meetings with domestic violence and sexual assault providers, as well as social and policy change providers to highlight and educate, as well as advocate around economic and housing needs for sexual violence survivors. Some of the most common meetings that our case managers engage in are meetings with providers that do anti-oppression work around issues of homelessness, affordable housing, and poverty. And then case managers do consults to improve trainings in housing policy compliance materials to ensure access to protections for survivors. For instance, our case managers contributed input to a recent Massachusetts housing handbook that is being used by property managers of federally funded housing to ensure compliance with housing rights and protections in admitting new tenants or sustaining existing tenants in safe and affordable housing situations in the aftermath of a sexual violence experience. And then the case managers also step in to write formal support or complaint letters based on survivors' experiences within systems and with specific providers within those systems that they're involved with to try to get some kind of economic justice to address their needs. In regard to legislative advocacy work, our participation in affairs related to legislative advocacy focuses on homelessness, affordable housing, and poverty-related policies that impact our survivors. We do participate through submitting written testimonies whenever possible, but really occasionally we ask our clients if it's a legislation that impacts them or has impacted them to ask if they can write a written testimony to back up a piece of legislation. Whenever possible, before the pandemic, we also did legislative visits where we spoke to our legislators about how, some of the affordable housing, homelessness issues impacted our clients to back up supporting certain legislation. And sometimes we also participated in submitting written comments on federal policies that impact our clients, as well as signing online action campaigns. So, again, to back up the framework, what I'm gonna share is a little bit of detail about some of the most common services that our case managers currently provide to address survivors' housing and economic needs in alignment with the framework. So in line with economic and housing justice needs, some of the most common services that we do provide are to do with educating clients about their housing rights and protections. We do write support letters, work collaboratively with housing providers, as well as legal services staff and mental health providers to support survivors' access to those rights in public and private housing. For instance, if a survivor wanted to break their lease prematurely without getting charged a financial penalty for breaking their lease prematurely as a result of an experience of sexual violence that is causing them to feel unsafe in their housing, we use this same approach to support that survivor. And then if a survivor is experiencing safety concerns, maybe because they were assaulted by their neighbor in a federally funded housing unit, we do support them in a similar way to access emergency transfer rights to feel safer. And then case managers do educate our clients about their eligibility and the process to apply for victim compensation funds. So our case management program works to advocate for survivors to access both our state's victim compensation program. However, we also work with other states' victim compensation programs in case, for instance, an incident happened out of Massachusetts and it happened in another state. So we do work with survivors and coordinate with our staff in those programs. We do try to coordinate to verify, eligibility, what information or verifications they need to submit to qualify for a claim. And then we do a lot of follow-up if a survivor is interested in that kind of support to make sure they access the victim compensation services that they do need. And then case managers also screen clients around their eligibility for housing stabilization funds from an economic or housing justice lens. If their needs are related to sexual violence, we do educate them about the application process for financial resources. We do write support letters, help them complete applications, sometimes coordinate with funding partners to advocate for them to access financial resources for funds that they need to most times meet their housing stability needs if they are impacted as a result of sexual violence. So the next example of services that we do provide under economic, longer-term housing and economic stability needs, case managers assist clients with access to affordable housing. In the second session on June 28th, I'm going to share more about how we engage with survivors in an individualized process to address their affordable housing needs. But briefly, what we do in this is that case managers do some counseling and support on different options to mitigate barriers that come up for our clients to access and maintain affordable housing. We assist them to complete applications, and we do write support letters to back up applications whenever that's feasible and necessary. In terms of the employment assistance as a long-term economic stability goal, one of our bilingual case managers' specialty role includes supporting our clients around creating individualized employment goals. And so this could mean, a client may be interested in getting access to job training resources or paying for those resources. Sometimes our clients may need help with, just getting connected to resources to obtain a new job. And sometimes it may mean writing a resume, accessing professional clothing for a job interview, or if they're beginning a new job. Those are all like specific roles that one of our bilingual case managers engages with one-on-one with clients to support them around their needs. And then our bilingual case manager also assists clients to access and maintain disability benefits. So this role also similarly includes educating and screening them for eligibility for these resources. He also supports them to obtain documents and to meet deadlines necessary to recertify, as well as supports them to appeal denials. He also works with other providers, whether mental health providers or other providers that may be involved with a client in a different capacity to help them access the benefits that they need. And the last example that is common for our clients our case managers to work with clients around their longer term economic needs is health insurance. And one of our bilingual case managers, who is also a certified health insurance counselor, assists clients with accessing and maintaining health insurance benefits. So in her role, she also educates and screens them for eligibility for health insurance, various types of health insurance. And then she assists them to collect and send the necessary verifications that they need to support and complete their applications. She also helps them to obtain documents and meet deadlines that are necessary to recertify for health insurance benefits, as well as also supports them to appeal denials and terminations of health insurance. And the final example of services that we provide under the framework for the shorter term housing and economic services is shelter and hotel access. So our case managers assist clients with access to family and domestic violence shelter assistance. So in this role, case managers educate and screen clients for their eligibility for these shelter systems. They support clients to obtain information and documentation in collaboration with shelter providers to complete the application process. Whenever feasible, before the pandemic, case managers also provided accompaniments, especially to family shelters, to support clients while they go through the application process. And then occasionally, when case managers, when a survivor lacks access to shelter because there is no shelter space available, however, if they do have like a plan of where they're gonna go in a few days, our case managers can help our clients to access funding to pay for a hotel for a couple of nights until they are able to move to that safer alternative option that they have. And then in terms of like food access, our case managers assist clients to access food resources in situations where the government food benefits program through the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, formerly food stamps, are not enough, in case those benefits are not enough, or in case they don't qualify due to different reasons, or in case they're just waiting for their benefits to get approved and they need food immediately. Our case managers can provide, grocery store gift cards. We also have funding partners that we've built relationships with that are able to provide timely 1 month long groceries for our clients. And then we also connect our clients to local food resources like food pantries and many others. And then in terms of storage, occasionally in situations where our clients need to store their personal belongings, for instance, if they're gonna go to a shelter, our case managers assist them in accessing funds, and then they do coordinate with storage companies to arrange for payment for services for an agreeable time period. So now I'm gonna share like 2 scenarios of some of the clients that we've worked with. And so as you listen to each of these scenarios, think about what interventions might apply in line with the case management framework. So Becca is gonna read each of the 2 scenarios, and I will share what interventions case management took to address the needs in each of those scenarios in line with the framework that I just shared. The case management framework handout is also in your packets, and it has real client situations and interventions that our case managers have applied to address clients' needs in alignment with the framework as well. And so I'll take it on to Becca to read the first scenario.
Okay, so this is the same scenario that we visited earlier. This was a client who was sexually assaulted by someone that he had known for a long time, and his trauma experience resulted in the loss of his job and housing. This client was unemployed and homeless for around 6 months. And during this time, he used his credit card to pay for food, gas, and hotels, amounting to about $9,000 in debt. This client was connected to case management after getting a new job and moving into a new apartment. However, he struggled to be able to move forward financially and in his healing because of the burden of his debt. He expressed feeling that every month he needed to choose between paying for rent and food versus trying to pay back what he owed on his credit cards.
Thank you, Becca. So some of the interventions that our case managers used to intervene in this first scenario, we did screen for this client's eligibility for victim compensation. And then that's in terms of the economic justice part of our framework. And then in terms of the short-term economic and housing stability interventions, our case managers screen this client for their eligibility for public benefits, specifically the SNAP or food stamps benefits. And then they assisted this client to access grocery store gift cards to help with immediate needs as they waited for their SNAP benefits. And then the case managers also assisted this client to access a gift card through a furniture store to replace furniture that was damaged during his move. In terms of the longer term housing and economic stability, our case managers contacted a community partner about his debt. So this partner did not help with credit card debts. So we lack finding resources that help with some of the unique needs. And then we try to get creative as case managers. So how else can we offset other common expenses that can be covered by our community partners so that you could, change and use the money that you'd have used to pay for those unique needs to pay for what the other partners cannot pay for. So in this situation, the client, because that community partner did not pay for credit card debt, so we try to advocate together with our client to access at least 6 months worth of rent, because that community partner would help with that kind of payment and was also willing to help offset the car payment debt. However, the client's car was not in his name. So what the community partner did is that they ultimately ended up paying for up to 8 months worth of rent so that the client could offset the 6 months worth of rent debt, as well as use the remaining money to pay off the car debt. So then the case management also referred this client to a credit counseling program after checking for the client's eligibility for this program. Keep in mind, we only refer clients to different resources after we're sure this is a resource that is going to help them. And for us in our case management program, our approach is that we have to call that resource. We have to speak to somebody in that resource, explain the client situation, and we have to make sure this is ultimately somebody that is going to help them in this program before we connect them to them. So that's how we ended up connecting this client to that credit counseling program. So the second scenario.
Okay, the second scenario, this is a client who relocated to Massachusetts due to both safety and health needs. Due to a disability from the sexual assault incident and due to immigration status, she was not able to work. She had significant physical injuries, including dental needs. She was able to stay with friends temporarily over the years. She obtained work authorization, got a part-time job, and rented an affordable room in a shared apartment. However, she lost that housing through a no-fault conviction. Due to changes in her income, she received a notice penalizing her for overpayment of benefits. She recently stopped working due to medical needs related to the sexual assault incident. She is also experiencing harassment from her current landlord and is not feeling safe, but does not have alternative affordable housing to go to.
Thank you, Becca. So as I mentioned earlier, it's common for our clients with multiple barriers or vulnerabilities to work with them for a longer period of time because of the systemic limitations that they encounter. So for this client, we actually are still working with her. And so far we have worked with her for over 8 years now. And so in terms of addressing her economic and housing justice needs, case managers screened her for eligibility for victim compensation. Her incident happened outside Massachusetts, and she had a lot of financial needs resulting from the incident. So we worked extensively with that state's victim compensation program where the incident occurred to cover various costs. We did have to follow up often with different program staff about specific details of the application process. We had to coordinate with medical providers to back up her application to claim victim compensation. And then in terms of the short-term economic and housing stability, case managers screened her for eligibility for disability benefits, as well as her emergency housing needs. So this survivor relocated to Massachusetts and did not have, a lot of resources, social supports to go to. So in the beginning, she stayed temporarily in a shelter until she was able to build some community with a few people and temporarily moved in with a few people. And so We also informed her about the limitations of, the resources that she was getting into. This is a common thing that when we are doing the education piece of our job, is that we not only explain to people about, this is what you qualify for after screening specifically, but we also explain to them about limitations of these resources, and so that they can have a full understanding of what resources exist for them, and so they can make a fully informed choice of how to move forward and direct us on how to work with them. That's an aspect of our empowerment model too, that we do fully inform our clients about the processes and limitations of the system they're getting involved with. And then we support their decision on how they want to move forward with it. And so we also did support this client to apply for and access short-term disability benefits. Then we did consult in terms of the harassment from her landlord currently. We had to involve a legal services agency to, figure out how best we can support this client who had a tough experience living in shelter. And so that wasn't an option, even though she was getting harassed by her landlord and wasn't feeling safer, but did not have income to pay for another place alternatively in the shorter time. So how do we work with her to stay safe in her existing situation in a way that is meaningful? And in this way, the meaningful way was to try to understand what are her rights in this current living situation to help her feel safer. So in this case, we had to consult with a legal services agency to figure out what the client's rights are, so she can continue to stay as safely as possible as she awaits an affordable housing spot to become available for her. So what we did learn is that from the lawyer is that the client has some rights to, first of all, write to the landlord to stop the harassment behavior and explain her rights. And then if the harassment does not stop, the client understood, and we did explain this to her, that she had the right to bring the landlord to court for her behavior, as well as she could take civil legal action against the landlord for the damage that the landlord is causing her in this current living situation. And then in terms of the longer term housing and economic stability, our case managers screened this client for eligibility for health insurance. So then we did work with this client to access affordable health insurance to be able to attend to the ongoing medical needs, mostly that she incurred as a result of her incident of sexual assault. Then we've worked with the state agency that was involved in penalizing her for the overpayment of benefits, which she didn't realize she even had to report that, there were changes to her income when she started working temporarily. Then which is a common experience that our clients have, is that sometimes, perhaps because of their trauma, they do not remember to follow through to update, the systems that they're involved with about changes in their income or changes in their, address, changes in their household size. And we do realize that sometimes clients get penalized for reasons beyond their control. So we had to step in and advocate with this state agency that was penalizing her for the overpayment of benefits, about her unique situation from a trauma-informed perspective, so they could waive that overpayment charge on her, which was successful. And then we continuously work with this client as we try to figure out safety measures in her current living situation. We are continuously working with her in applying for affordable housing because she's living on a limited income right now. She's out of work, she's on disability benefits again. And so we're working with her to apply for any priorities for housing that she qualifies for based on her disability. We've also worked with different medical providers to access free treatment for dental needs beyond what victim compensation in this state could cover for her. And then we've also helped her to apply for and access the RIDE transportation program for discounted and accessible transportation services to help her access personal and medical appointments. So next slide. So these are some references from Becca, and now I'm going to turn it over to Janice for questions and answers. And then we have one last slide, which is an extra slide that also has more statistics.
Thank you, everybody. It makes my head spin, Claire, to hear you talking about all of those resources, because I'm not sure I would know where to start with folks. We have some questions that did come through, and I want to encourage other folks to continue to use the chat to add some of their questions. I'm going to actually start with the last question that came from our colleagues at Independence House. Do you have a time frame for working with clients? Is there a limitation on how long you'll work with folks? And then I'll ask also, and what is the average amount of time that you work with clients?
Thank you for that question. So we actually do not have a time. That's part of our trauma-informed approach, is that we do not have a timeline of how long we work with clients, because like this example of client that I just mentioned here, we've worked with her for over 8 years now. And
Wow.
so because she has very unique needs that are all like mostly involved with systems, and there is always like, she also has some language barriers too. And she has a significant disabilities from our incident. So we work with each client uniquely. However, there is some clients that we only work with in one session who just want to know, what are my rights to breaking my lease, or do I qualify for victim compensation? And I already have the application and I know how to go about it. So there is clients that we work with briefly in one session. I did mention earlier that our average number of sessions we encounter with clients is 3.4 hours and up to an average of 14 sessions per client. But that there is no limit to the timeline of our services, because we do know that our survivors experience multiple barriers, and the survivors that have a harder time accessing economic stability are the ones that experience multiple barriers. So our approaches keep that in mind in working with them.
Thank you. Another person asked, did you consider, or do you do debt negotiation for folks that have credit card debt? And
yeah, yes, yeah, we do that sometimes. And for instance, one of our clients who had just recently got a car on a loan, and was assaulted a few days later in that car. Wanted to return that car, and that had a big implication on paying for that car. So we had to reach out to that car company with her permission to explain her situation and to ask if they could give her another new car, because she had just got a new car, without recharging her a whole new amount, because she had already started using this car. So somehow it had lost some value. So we do reach out to, companies, whether credit card or car companies like this, depending on each client's unique situation. And we do try to advocate, and we're successful in advocating with this particular car company. Sometimes it's luck, but we always look at each situation uniquely, and we always go beyond the usual way of advocating for clients, which this is a situation that we never have thought of, getting involved in, like reaching out to a Toyota car company to ask them to change and give the client another car, but it ended up working out. So it's about, getting the client's permission to share their story so that they can get what's right for them, if possible. And, most times they are successful. So yes, we do that.
Oh, I would assume that they've never been asked that question before at the car company. There's something, see?
Yes.
Another opportunity for education. I have a question that, what are the key pieces of information about economic costs that agencies like the folks who are on this call should focus on if they're seeking funds? So what would you suggest would be the key points? And I guess this is for both of you, Becca and Claire, that if you were to pick a few things to make sure people mention when they're talking about sexual violence and why funds are needed for sexual violence.
Yeah, so I can go first, Becca, if you don't mind. So, session 2 is gonna cover a lot of that. We do have how we assess for clients' needs in details, but in general, it could be a question just like, are you having safety concerns? Do you have any financial needs resulting from sexual violence? It could just be a question like that can bring up what you may need to know for you to then support a survivor around what specifically they need. However, that being said, the most common needs that come up for our clients are housing, financial needs, and then of course, medical costs resulting from sexual violence. And relatively common is like income loss due to sexual violence. So in that, there can be like, yes, talking to clients about their rights to access these resources that are specific for survivors, like housing rights, which means it may be that you will be able to access these housing rights and break your lease without getting charged a financial penalty. Or it may be that you may need also to relocate to a new moving situation. You may also need some help with paying for the relocation costs or initial housing fee deposits. So it varies, but that's the most common one that I can practically think of.
Thank you. Becca, did you have anything you wanted to add in?
I mean, I'll just zoom out and give a very sort of high level answer to that question, which is, as I said at the beginning, very, very often when we're talking about sexual assault and the consequences of it, there's this sort of laser focus on health, including physical and mental health. And there isn't a discussion that this creates costs, dollar costs for survivors, and that this disrupts income, and that can have a cascading effect on a survivor's economic well-being over the long term, in addition to in the immediate term. So I think there's kind of a first level need before we even get into the brilliance of all the things that Claire said. It's sort of like, I think there's a high level need for people involved in social policy and social services and victim services kind of across the board to understand there are these real costs and survivors have these real economic needs. And not to sort of brush them aside or assume that they don't exist. And then I think we get into all of the things that Claire said, which is absolutely right on.
Thank you. So there were a couple of questions that were already answered. So I'm going to try to go to the questions that weren't already answered. Becca had given some answers in the chat, but I think that Diana Mancera mentioned that maybe not everybody was getting access to those questions. So at the end of this, I'll review those as well. There's a really broad question that came up that I think would be interesting to hear about. What's causing the dramatic increase in sexual violence? There's a big question for you.
I'm not sure if I can really answer this question. I mean, I think we know that with the pandemic, there have been a number of risk factors going up for both intimate partner violence and other forms of sexual violence where people were stuck in situations that they couldn't get out of and put them in very high risk. We also are seeing an increase in reporting of or acknowledgement of violence that's been happening that may or may not reflect an actual increase in violence being perpetrated. So it's often hard in terms of statistics to sort out whether we're seeing an increase in violence or just an increase in reporting or acknowledging violence. Claire, I don't know if you'd have anything you'd like to add.
Yes, that's right on, Becca. And just in addition to that, sexual violence is about power and control in general. And so perpetrators usually target people because of their vulnerabilities. And the most common one that has come up recently, especially during the pandemic, which actually necessitated us doing a training with the Department of Justice, was landlords themselves, taking advantage of, low-income tenants' inability to pay their rent because maybe they were working jobs that were most impacted by the pandemic, and asking for sexual favors in terms of paying rent. And so this is just one example that doesn't encompass the whole picture, but it just gives a context of sexual violence. And perpetrators having power and control and using people's vulnerabilities, in this case, low income status, to kind of exercise that power to abuse survivors. But of course, again, similar to what Becca shared, people are becoming more and more, for different reasons, able to report and sexual violence. And that's why perhaps the statistics are increasing, but also it's all the other factors too about, perpetrators having more power and control of the survivors.
Thank you. Agree with all of that. Do partnering agencies require documentation that sexual assault took place before they will agree to provide assistance to a survivor? And if they do, does the RCC work out criteria or paperwork or anything saying this is a client of our agency?
Yes.
And how do you do that? What do you do that maintains the confidentiality of the client?
Yes.
Or what kind of permission do you get from the survivor to speak on their behalf? Written permission, I would say.
Yes, of course. So we always get clients' permission to speak with a third party or another organization outside our agency. And we only share information if it's gonna be necessary to support that client's need. And it's not a requirement. It also depends on what need a client has. So for instance, if we are working with somebody whose landlord is pushing back on them breaking their lease if they are feeling unsafe, and the landlord, for instance, this is a common scenario, the landlord, for instance, says, you need to talk to my lawyer. I can't be involved in this because I need you to pay all the months of rent until your lease expires in 6 months. In those cases, we also involve legal services because I'm a social worker. And so if it gets to, even though I'm trained to advocate for clients to exercise their rights, and most times I do succeed, sometimes when it gets to the level of a lawyer, a landlord's lawyer getting involved, we need to involve legal services to so that they can work with the landlord's lawyer. So in those cases, the legal services also want us as the first people that were received information about the incident to write backup letters to support the client's situation so that the lawyers can advocate with the landlord's lawyer to make sure the client gets out of the lease under the exercising of their rights without getting charged a financial penalty. So in those cases, because we are gonna share more information about the client's situation in line with what their needs are, we need to explain that to the client that this is the information you're gonna need to share. We also involve them in writing the letter that we're writing for them. And then we get their permission to share the letter after they've read it with the lawyer so that the lawyer can then work alongside the landlord's lawyer to get them out of their leases. And in terms of accessing, other like resources, like for instance, a housing priority, sometimes the letters that they need are not necessarily from me as a case manager. There are letters that may be needed from a mental health provider, and that mental health provider may be a clinician within our organization. But even within our organization, we have to get permission from our client to share information from case management and clinical services within our program so that we can get a clinician to write a backup letter to support a client's application for maybe an emergency transfer, for a different type of housing unit, or maybe even a housing priority, depending on what the need is, or maybe even getting disability benefits. We always have to involve clients fully, and fully means also like explaining to them specific details of what this letter is gonna look like or what this document is gonna look like and why it's necessary. But sometimes we have to also push back because some providers may not necessarily be up to date on what requirements are really necessary to help our clients access their rights. So sometimes if a client, for instance, self-certifies that they experienced abuse, you can't then ask for a police report. You can't then ask for my, written permission. So sometimes it's asked about, not necessarily negotiating, but using it as a turn of an education opportunity to the provider to say that according to these protections and rights, a client can self-certify, can just write a letter on their own, within their own words, from their own experience, what is necessary, and that should be enough for them to qualify for that protection. So sometimes it's just getting creative, but also like from our SIG model, the knowledge part, being as informed as possible to make sure whatever documents or information that is being asked for is information that is actually necessary. And then sometimes with our funding partners, because we work with a lot of funding partners, we also explain to them that it may not be necessary to give the details because we work with trauma survivors. If you're gonna ask us for us to ask for information that we don't normally ask our clients for, because that might be triggering for them, we ask if there is a different way they may want us to ask that information for them to still assist the client with the funds. So sometimes it's negotiating with these relationships that we have.
That was really helpful. Thank you very much. What's the average cost to have a case manager on staff? I'm guessing that we have some programs that are much, much smaller than Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, which, by the way, if you're not from our state, serves Boston, several large other cities around Boston, and how many other suburban areas? Probably 27, I think, other communities. It is by far the largest rape crisis center in Massachusetts. We have one rape crisis center, for example, that serves the island of Nantucket, and that is it. So much smaller budget, much smaller program. And so what would it cost to keep a case manager approximately on staff?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So first of all, we're lucky that we have individualized programs within our Rape Crisis Center. So our case management program is the only one that does entirely support clients around housing and financial and health insurance needs. And then we do work with 29 towns and cities within the greater Boston area. And then recently, because of capacity, we've tried to limit our services to survivors who are outside our service area, but we also are open to working with survivors outside our service area in case the rape crisis centers closer to them do not provide the kind of support that we do provide here. And then in terms, I forgot the other question that you asked. What was the other question, Janice?
I mute myself between the average cost of
the average cost. Thank you. So right now, most recent bilingual case manager in terms of salary gets paid the lower $40,000 per year. And that's just in terms of the staff salary.
Could you say that number again? I didn't catch it.
The lower 40,000 for the most recent case manager that we hired. They get paid that annually. And we also have interns that do provide similar services like the staff case managers. And because interns are doing it for school and we don't yet have the capacity to pay them, they also provide almost as much as what a part-time case manager could have provided in services. So if you kind of estimate that based on the most recent full-time case manager, maybe interns provide services for up to about $20,000 a year, because they're usually like here for a full year.
Thank you. Pathways for Change, our program serves the largest physical service area, but Boston Area Rape Crisis Center has the largest population. I should have been more specific about that in our particular state. Right. You really did address who qualifies for your program. I did have a question that came up when you were talking about referring to legal services. There are also a problem, sorry. There are probably also other programs that don't have attorneys on staff. Do you use external partners that provide legal services as well?
Yes, actually our attorneys at the Boston Area Rape Crisis Centers do not provide the kind of legal support that our clients in case management need. So we always use attorneys or work with attorneys outside the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center. And so I don't know if this would be helpful to share because it's national, but like, so we work with local attorneys that some of them that specifically work on survivors' housing rights, and some of them that work on like general housing legal issues.
That is helpful, thank you. Let's see. My cat just knocked my phone off the table, so therefore I think that we only have 2 minutes left. All right. And who, I think it was answered in the question and answer. There was a question about who's eligible for services for your program. And you did say that you see people outside of your service area if that is requested. And what is the youngest age that you will serve a client?
Yes,
or case management?
So we work with survivors 12 years and above, and that's across all our services at the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center. And it doesn't matter how long ago that incident happened for us to be able to work with somebody. It could have happened, 2 days ago. It could have happened 40 years ago. So there is no timeline as long as they are a survivor of sexual violence. Regardless of when it happened, we do work with them. And 12 years and above. And we also work with significant others. And for us in case management, it's usually parents or legal guardians of survivors.
Thank you. A question had come up a while back about whether or not survivors of sexual violence are able to access shelter services. And I think, Amy, you mentioned that there's a program in perhaps the state of Vermont that has a residential program for survivors of sexual assault. And I know that most programs with difficulty, a survivor of sexual violence who is assaulted outside of an intimate partner relationship is the sticking point that we have run into in Massachusetts on a number of times, because the person is often vetted to see if the violence was within a relationship. But as you have described today, as you both described today, there are so many scenarios where that is not the case for sexual violence. And so resources for residential services for sexual assault survivors, do they exist or are they pretty rare?
I know we've run out of time, but I can briefly answer that survivors of sexual violence, regardless of the relationship with the perpetrator, should be eligible for domestic violence shelter space in Massachusetts. We've run into those situations and we've had to reach out with that particular shelter that has arisen to deny them shelter even when they have space to advocate. And I know we've worked with DPH on some of those situations before where we've had to push back on that. And so it hasn't come up as a barrier most recently. But we also work with survivors who may have children to navigate access to family shelter as another option in case that's the only alternative they have to, addressing their immediate housing safety needs. And so that's a whole different system that we explore, but it is those adoptions that we keep in mind in case there is children in that household.
Excellent. There was the final thing that I'm going to say, because I know we are past time, is there was a request, if you have an example of a confidential agreement that has been, written between one of your client survivors and an external agency that obviously non-identifying information, perhaps we could talk about that, or I don't know if you were going to talk about that in the next session. So I just wanted to throw that out to you and to think about for the next session. I want to thank everybody who is on the call, who was on the call. I think we were up to 107 participants at one point in time. I want to thank the sign language interpreters. Thank you for your participation. And we look forward to all of you if you're able to participate on the next call. And we will have a couple of other resource folks that we might be able to tap into on the next call as well. We have people from the Victim Rights Law Center who will be participating in the next call. And we will have, I hope, our victim compensation colleagues on the call the next time. And Deanna Mancera will give our welcoming remarks on the next call from our coalition. That is on the 24th, Amy? Is that right?
No, the 28th.
Sorry, I just lied to you all. I'm sorry. The 28th from 1 to 3 again, and we will have time for questions and answers on that call as well. If you think of something in the meantime, feel free to email us or to email our folks here. Great questions, and we really appreciate your participating. And thank you.
Yes, thank you, Becca, and thank you, Claire, for joining us. And thank you all for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you on the 28th.
Yes, I learned a lot today. Thank you.
Thank you.